Firearms inspection and troubleshooting. This week's discussion will be centered on recoil operated actions. And these actions are actions that most of us will be familiar with, if not all of us. But first and foremost, we have to discuss, do you have the right tools? And this week's focus or this week's spotlight is going to center around having a good quality punch set. And guys, like I always tell you, you do not have to go out and get the most expensive thing. This little punch set cost me less than $20 on Amazon, and it gets the job done. It has what you need. On one head of the hammer is a brass head. On the other head, there's more like a hard plastic head. And as you can see, the punch set comes with both iron and brass punches. You have to be careful because these will bend. The more expensive quality sets, those punches don't bend as easily. So you have to kind of go with what their budget says you can do, right? But you will need a good punch set because at some point or another, you will have to remove some of those smaller pins. And you don't want to go using something that's not really used for firearms because you may damage those pins or you may damage the surrounding area where those pins are removed from. But make sure you get yourself a good punch set, guys. Now, let us talk a little bit about recoil operated actions. You'll find these mostly in semi-automatic pistols, but there are exceptions as well. The Desert Eagle is one exception, being a gas-operated semi-automatic pistol. And the most distinguishing characteristic of those recoil-operated actions is that they operate from a locked and closed breech. All right, they operate from a locked and closed breech. So anytime you have a firearm that is in battery, that is what we call hot, and that slide is in the resting position, there's a round in the chamber, it is locked at that time, all right? And the action will be operated by the recoil that is created when a round is shot. So recoil operated actions, all right, guys? Now, today's pistol that we'll be looking at is going to be a SIG Legion 229. Now, you always know, guys, that we are going to start with a safety inspection. So the first thing we always want to do is go ahead and eject that magazine. And we are ejecting the magazine first and foremost to ensure that the firearm is both clear and empty. Now, this is going to be a two-stage process. When we look at this magazine after it is ejected, we are looking for the follower or training rounds only. Now, we can go ahead and lock that slide to the rear and go ahead and perform our safety check. So we are checking the chamber, we're checking the breech face, and we're also checking that magazine well. And we usually use a digit to get down in there just to make sure that our physical inspection is thorough. Now you can go ahead and activate your takedown lever and gently go ahead and release that slide. And once the slide assembly comes off, like always, guys, you can go ahead and remove that guide rod and recoil spring. And you can also, at this time, go ahead and remove your barrel. And now you have those four major components that we need to inspect. A thorough inspection of the internal components, and we've talked about this in previous lesson, guys. We want to make sure that we are going over all of the parts of that slide to make sure that that slide will work effectively when that pistol is back together. We're also looking at the barrel. Remember, check that barrel hood, check your feed ramps, right? Check the internal part of the bore. Make sure there's no issues with that rifling, okay? And also, you want to check out your recoil spring and your guide rod. Make sure everything is good with those. Now, when you're inspecting the frame, of course, you want to inspect the rails that are attached to the frame, just like you're checking those rails on the slide. You also want to check that trigger assembly as well to make sure that is functioning properly. If there's a external safety, then of course you want to check that to make sure that it moves in the direction that it should, that it's not loose and wiggling and things of that nature. So we always want to make sure that we're conducting a very, very, very thorough inspection of all internal components. And now we know that the reassembly process is basically doing everything that we did to field strip, but going in that opposite order. So go ahead and put that pistol back together, and then we can get ready for our function and safety checks. Now, some of the safety inspection and function checks that we're going to do on most of these classic line SIG pistols are going to include, but it's definitely not limited to, but it will definitely include ensuring that that slide moves freely back and forth along the frame. All right, and we're going to do this by racking the slide several times. And remember, guys, when you release that slide, do not ride the slide. Don't ride the slide, guys. Let it move freely as it would when the firearm is being shot. Also, you want to check to ensure that when you depress that magazine release button, that the magazine falls freely from the frame, all right? Falls freely from that magazine well. You want to make sure that nothing is holding it up from falling freely. If it does, then you want to immediately start to check the feed lips on that magazine and make sure those guys haven't started to bulge out, right? That's a common problem with 1911s. Okay, so you want to check to ensure that when you depress that magazine release button, that the magazine does fall freely. You also, on these lines of pistols, you want to check that decocker. Okay, so go ahead, once you have that pistol back together, go ahead and cock the hammer manually or with the slide, okay? And then go ahead and check to make sure that the decocker functions properly. And also, you want to check to make sure that that double action trigger press works correctly, because this is a double action, single action pistol. So you want to make sure that that double action trigger press does work. So what we're checking to make sure is that it both cocks and releases that hammer force effectively, guys. And just like with every week's discussion, I always want to leave you guys with a few important takeaways. Just remember, these are just the little tidbits to make sure that we keep our minds focused. Now, first and foremost, we always want to ensure that there is no live ammunition present in your workspace. And it's going to be very important, guys. And I tell you every week, remember the simple math equation. We've got three variables: the shooter, the firearm, and the ammunition. On the other side of that equation, we have a discharge. So if we remove one of those variables, being the ammunition, then we can ensure that we are safe, right? And that firearm will not discharge as long as we're handling it. Next, you always want to remember that the thorough inspection of all internal components made for these types of pistols and other types of pistols may in fact mean that you will have to break it down further than your simple field strip process, which means either A, that you will need to have some familiarity with that firearm before taking it and agreeing to do that kind of work, or B, you have a good grasp on that owner's manual and you have that confidence that you can get that work done, right? Recoil operated actions will distinguish themselves from other actions because they have a closed and locked breech. These actions are operated from a closed and locked breech, all right? And the recoil is used to operate the action. And remember those 8 steps, and we talked about those last week. Remember the 8 cycles of operation, guys. Don't ever forget that. And last but not least, you always want to ensure that you do not have any live ammunition present in your workspace. It's a dedicated space purely for work, purely for training, whatever the case may be, right? But we do not have any live ammunition there. And just like every week, guys, I have to pose a question or two just to keep your minds going. And when it comes to recoil operated actions, what is the best practice? Is there a best way to mitigate those heavier recoil? If there is, what is it? What practices do you employ to mitigate heavier recoil? Maybe some of your students can benefit from some of the things that you're doing. Let's have a good week, guys, and hey, let's get to work.